Hello, welcome back to our lecture series for Western Civilization 101. Today's topic will focus on the Germanic peoples. Lecture title is Germanic Barbarians. In fact, that's what the Romans called these different groups of people that lived on the European continent to the north of Rome, outside of Rome's boundaries, at least for a while there. You know, you've already had your lecture discussing the late empire, and we see that the Roman Empire is collapsing. In fact, the western half will collapse quite a bit sooner than the eastern half. Rome is experiencing a manpower shortage. We have a plague that will come along the Silk Road. It's a trading route from China that will devastate the Roman Empire. And there's a labor shortage because Rome, during the empire, Rome is not conquering like they used to. So Rome is not getting all that wealth in, new wealth coming into the city. And you have a major class distinction between the very, very rich and the poor. And so these very wealthy citizens wanted luxury goods. They had a taste for the good life. And so they would do a lot of purchasing outside of in the eastern half of the empire. So we're going to see a lot of that money and currency moving to the east. The eastern half will get, around Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, will gain more wealth. The western half, kind of centered in Rome and in what is now Italy, will become poorer. The government will. Also, slaves. We're not getting, an increase in slavery like we've seen in past lectures. And so what we're going to notice is some of these emperors will actually invite some of these Germanic peoples to serve in the Roman army because there's not enough Roman citizens to do it. And so not only will we have some fighting between the Romans and these different Germanic peoples to the north, but we will also see the Germanic tribes, of course, participating in Roman society and in the Roman army. Now there you'll hear about today, of course, in more detail about the Germanic peoples. There were different groups of them. You'll hear about the Visigoths, who will eventually settle in Spain. They were allowed into Rome's borders by an Eastern Roman emperor by the name of Valens. And problem is that the Romans treated the Visigoths so poorly. It was just cruel and inhumane how they treated the Visigoths once they allowed them to come and settle within Rome's frontier. There was another group called the Huns that were kind of pushing the Visigoths from behind. In fact, the Visigoths, in order to get food, would have to give their children into slavery for food. Just cruel treatment. Well, they end up actually rebelling, and they will eventually sack the city of Rome and then, of course, settle within the western half and create their own kingdom, the Visigothic kingdom, there in where Spain is today. You also have another group of Germanic peoples called the Ostrogoths, who will eventually take over the Italian peninsula and kind of make their own kingdom there. And you have another group called the Franks, who will settle in what is today modern France. The Franks probably have the most in common with the Roman Empire. In fact, the Franks will be the longest lasting of these Germanic peoples, Germanic tribes. You have the Angles and Saxons up there in Britain and in the very extreme northern part of the European continent. You have another group called the Vandals. The Vandals will eventually make their way and settle in North Africa and establish a kingdom there. They will become known for their kind of piracy. They would terrorize the Mediterranean and plunder Rome. In fact, their wanton destruction. That's where we get the word vandalize from, these people, this Germanic tribe. So there was a lot of different groups that will encompass the Germanic barbarians, according to the Romans. And as we'll see in this lecture, these Germanic tribes will basically split the western half of the Roman Empire into their own kingdoms. And the western half will no longer be viable. It will no longer be the Western Roman Empire. The East, like I said, is wealthier, and there's other reasons you'll learn about, of course, but the East will survive quite a bit longer as the Roman Empire. And we'll also discover when we get into the Byzantine Empire, which is an upcoming lecture, that an emperor, an Eastern emperor by the name of Justinian, his goal will be to reconquer the Mediterranean and make it once again a Roman lake. And he will accomplish this, but at a very high cost, because it was very expensive to do this, to reconquer. He wanted to bring back the might of the Roman Empire. But in doing so, of course, it will hurt him in the long run. So let's learn more about the Germanic barbarians.
Today we're going to lecture on the northern neighbors of the Romans, and these are the Germanic peoples known as the Barbarians. The word barbarian itself was a Greek word which the Romans appropriated for themselves and used it in Latin, barbari. The name does not designate any cultural connotation. Instead, barbaros in Greek meant a foreign-speaking person because it sounded to the Greeks as if the people were saying bar, 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 bar. The Romans inherited this idea and applied barbarian to all non-Latin or Greek-speaking peoples, but more specifically, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the word barbarian came to be reserved for Germanic peoples. Now, Germanic-speaking peoples had become the dominant people to the east of the Rhine River and north of the Danube, probably in the 2nd or the 1st century BC, displacing native Celts and other peoples in the area. The Germanic tradition tells us that the Germans initially migrated down from Scandinavia, in particular the island of Gotland, and this comes from the 6th century AD Gothic historian Jordanes. So this is the Germanic kind of background, but we assume that they probably were always in Central or Eastern Europe and simply began to migrate westwards. Now, as the Roman Republic changed into an empire, the Germans were gradually becoming the dominant peoples in Central Europe, displacing many of the Celtic peoples. And in the 2nd century and early 1st century BC, the Romans first came into military contact with the Germans as they crossed the Alps. Now, for the most part, in the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD, the Romans had reached a status quo with the Germans and had stabilized the boundaries. Usually, the standard continental boundaries of the Roman Empire will be the Rhine River on its western flank and the Danube River on its northern flank. And north of these two areas, we have Germanic-speaking peoples. And this was pretty much the case throughout much of the Pax Romana, the long Roman peace established by Augustus and lasting until the reign of Marcus Aurelius, with a few exceptions. Most notably, in the late 1st century BC, Augustus had briefly occupied parts of Germania and had in fact incorporated it into the empire as the province of Germania. But as it happened in the first decade of the 1st century AD, a revolt led to the destruction of 3 Roman legions, and hereafter Germania as a Roman province was lost. Augustus later said, never try to conquer Germany, that there's no reason why the area east of the Rhine River or north of the Danube should be conquered by Rome because it has nothing to offer. There's no higher civilization, there's no wealth. There are peoples living at a lower standard of civilization who happen to be foreign-speaking peoples or barbarians. Now, the Romans would have had much contact with German-speaking peoples, especially along the frontier, because in frontier towns, Germans would have been attracted to Roman towns and Roman markets and Roman goods, of course. Germans permeated the empire in many other ways too, because many served as auxiliaries in the army, and you could be promoted rapidly through the army and receive an important position, and also perhaps citizenship and a pension. So many Germans became Romanized in this manner throughout the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD. Another way in which the Romans were exposed to the German barbarians was using a system known as the federate system, or the system of federales. Now, this has been a system that had been experimented with before, but Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century AD was the first emperor to use it on a very large scale. And what he did is he would resettle friendly tribes of German-speaking peoples in imperial territory. That is, in the border areas along the Rhine and the Danube. Rather than pay for the expense of defending these areas yourself, it made more sense to simply to bring over Germanic peoples, friendly Germanic peoples, who would be given land and who would defend the empire for you. So this system of federates, or federate, became widespread by near the end of the 2nd century AD, as Marcus Aurelius used it on a fairly large scale. Now, later critics complained that he barbarized the empire, that is, the fringes that became less and less Roman in appearance and more German in complexion. Well, that's not necessarily true, because in the border areas, there was a lot of intermingling between Roman and German. And even in Germanic areas, there was a lot of intermingling of Roman ideas and Roman goods with Germanic peoples and Germanic goods. So there was a lot of cross-cultural connection in these areas. So when the Germans entered the empire, those closest to the Roman Empire would have been very familiar with the empire and its institutions already. Generally, the Roman policy was to settle friendly Germans as federates on the boundaries, but the hostile Germans in the interior of what is now Eastern and Central Europe, you would pit the hostile Germanic tribes against one another. And you could do that by means of bribes or by other inducements. So as long as the Germans were fighting with each other, they weren't fighting with you. So you didn't have to worry about your northern flank, as the Germans were preoccupied amongst themselves. And this was standard Roman policy throughout the 1st and the 2nd centuries AD. And this policy worked very well for the Romans. That is, during the Pax Romana, lasting up until 180, there were very few problems on the Romans' northern flank. The only serious problems began to occur during the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and that's when the Danube frontier began to break down. And along the Danube River, we have Germanic tribes who, attracted to Rome, began to permeate the border and raid Roman towns across the Danube. This problem was exacerbated during the reign of Marcus Aurelius by many other things. The Roman government was, of course, overextended. There were several problems coming in that set to the end of the Pax Romana. But this was simply one of them, that the Roman Empire was so overextended, it was difficult for it to defend all of its boundaries at the same time. And one of the first trouble areas that the Romans found was the Danube frontier. And this frontier began to break down during the 3rd century, or the late 2nd and throughout the 3rd century. Now, during the 3rd century, as we've seen, we have the dynasty of Septimius Severus, and then we have a long series of emperors known as the Barracks emperors, because they were made or unmade within the imperial, or within the army barracks. So we have a long series of generals who are would-be emperors, and at various points we have as many as 8 different people proclaiming themselves Roman emperors simply because their troops had proclaimed them emperor. So we have rival claimants. We have a breakdown of central authority in the 3rd century. And this breakdown of central authority leads to civil war in the interior, and on the exterior, it leaves the Romans open to invasion. Now, once the Danube frontier started to break down, the cities on the Roman side of the Danube began to appear very attractive to Germans, because these are areas that you could loot and pillage and then return home with the goods. And during the 3rd century, we started to see Germanic raids deep into Roman territory. In the Balkans, areas such as modern-day Austria and Hungary were ravaged by Germanic troops. And then also the Rhine frontier along Gaul began to break down, and we have Germanic groups which penetrate deep within the Roman frontier along the Rhine River. So both the Rhine and the Danube River started to become destabilized in the 3rd century as central authority began to break down. Central authority could no longer keep these two boundaries, the Rhine and the Danube, as the standard boundaries for the Roman Empire, and increasingly Germanic peoples permeated these boundaries. Most of these Germanic peoples did not stay for good. They came, they plundered, and they left. But increasingly, the frontier provinces became more and more frontier in appearance and less Roman. Other problems came. Many times, these Germanic tribes would penetrate deep into Roman territory. As one example, the Emperor Aurelian in the 270s was forced to build a new city wall around the city of Rome. As Rome itself was jeopardized, the barbarians necessitated a new wall to protect the citizens of Rome. So as we have the boundaries begin to break down, we have problems. Now, for the most part, there were friendly Germanic peoples established in the boundaries, but increasingly in the 3rd century we have Germanic raids deep in the Roman territory, especially along the Danube frontier. Now, this was pretty much a situation until the late 3rd century AD, and it was the Emperor Diocletian in the 280s and 290s that was able to restabilize the Rhine and the Danube. And once the Rhine and the Danube rivers were restabilized, the Germans ceased to have become as much of a nuisance, although they still continued to be a partial nuisance. The Romans, however, did have to evacuate some provinces. The major one was Dacia, or modern-day Romania, which lay on the northern side of the Danube River, and it was simply, after the 3rd century, unholdable with the large Germanic presence there. And as a result, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, these Germanic peoples began to settle down in different parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, it's important to remember that there never was this great Germanic kingdom. These Germanic peoples were tribal in unit, and all were led by chieftains. So there were many varieties of Germanic tribes and many Germanic dialects. Not all of them were in Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, many of them were in Scandinavia. But by the 4th century, we have a pattern that emerges that remains true going into the 5th century, and that is the largest Germanic groups have settled in specific areas. The Ostrogoths, one Germanic group, had settled in what's modern-day Ukraine. The Visigoths, another Germanic tribe, and related to the Ostrogoths, have settled in what was Old Roman Dacia or Romania. The Franks had settled along the right bank of the Rhine River, or the eastern flank of the Rhine River in the modern-day Rhineland. And other groups, such as the Vandals, were settled in the Lombards in the central Germanic regions. So the Romans had essentially reached a status quo with the Germanic peoples. There were trading relationships with the Germanic peoples, but they were still tribal in nature. The only major difference, or the only major change that occurred in the 4th century, apart from the Germans becoming sedentary, was their adoption of Christianity. However, it is important to note that not all the Germanic tribes converted to Christianity, and in fact, the ones that did converted to the wrong form of Christianity because they converted to the Arian rather than the Nicene form of Christianity, which, as we've already seen, in the year 325, the Council in Nicaea had defined the relationship of the Father and Son as being co-eternal, co-equal, and consubstantial. The Arian version of Christianity, as we recall, subordinated the Son to the Father. Hence, when the Germans did convert to Christianity, they converted by means of a Gothic missionary named Ulfilas. And Ulfilas had been a student of people who had been influenced by Arius and the teachings of Arius. So Ulfilas taught an Arian form of Christianity. He created an alphabet for the Germanic peoples known as Gothic, and translated parts of the New Testament and the Psalms for these people. And many of these Germanic tribes, in particular the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Lombards, all converted to the Arian form of Christianity. So when the Germans did enter the empire after the 4th century, they entered not only as Germanic peoples, but also as heretics. So that was one important distinction between the two groups. Now, things might have stayed pretty much as they had been throughout much of the 4th century, with stationary, stable Germanic units along the Rhine and the Danube rivers. But as it happened, events put the Germans into motion yet once again. And in fact, in the 4th century, we have new peoples who emerge from the east. And these are steppe peoples. These are peoples on horseback who come from the east, who will raid across the Eurasian steppe. And that is the huge steppe, which extends from Hungary all the way to China. And these people are known as the Huns. And in the mid-4th century, they had been repelled on the Chinese frontier, and they're pushed to the west, possibly because of the lure of the Roman Empire. And what happens is the areas that the Huns overrun, they conquer, and they force the conquered into army service, into military service. And so increasingly groups along the way are conquered, forced to pay tribute, and are incorporated into this Hunnic state and forced to serve in the Hunnic army. Now, we know much about the Huns from the Roman sources, and they indicate to us that the Huns were extremely dangerous people who walked with a strange gaunt because they lived their life on horseback. They slept, ate, did everything on horseback. And according to one tradition, they even cooked on horseback because they simply put the raw meat underneath their saddles and let it cook as they rode. What we do know, however, is that the Germanic peoples were afraid of the Huns. And the first major Germanic group that came into contact with the Huns was the Ostrogoths. And the Ostrogoths were rapidly overrun. That is, the Ostrogoths that had been settled in the area around modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia, were overwhelmed by the Huns and were forced into military service, were incorporated into this Hunnic state, and it was an experience that was very traumatic for other Germanic peoples, and in fact it scared the Visigoths. And the Visigoths, who would have been the next Germanic group in line to be overrun, were desperately looking for aid. They didn't want to be overrun and incorporated into this Hunnic state. They were afraid of the Huns. And that's one thing that all the Germanic peoples were afraid of the Huns. So as it happened, in 375, the Visigoths sent emissaries to the Eastern Roman Emperor. And they asked for permission for the emperor in Constantinople to settle the Visigoths within the state as federates or federati. Now, this was unprecedented because although other emperors had incorporated Germans in the empire as federates or allies, we're talking about a whole tribal unit. We're talking about over 100,000 people, and we're not simply talking warriors. We're also talking children and wives in large groups. And faced with this type of situation, imperial policy really had to consider how it wanted to deal with the situation. Now, the Eastern Emperor at the time, Valens, actually said yes. He thought it would be a good idea to resettle the Visigoths as federati within the Roman state, probably thinking that at some point the Romans themselves would have to face the Huns. And the Visigoths themselves would provide the buffer and the protection along the Danube frontier. So Valens said yes. And then the Visigoths began to make plans to relocate themselves within the Roman Empire, kind of in modern-day southern Romania, northern Bulgaria. And as you can imagine, we're talking over 100,000 people, so the logistics would have been extremely difficult. You have to provide food, shelter, transportation for a large number of peoples. These are very, very proud Germanic peoples, and they had to request aid from Rome. And when they came into the Roman Empire, they were coming in as refugees. These weren't conquerors. And you can imagine the logistics must have been nightmarish to transfer over 100,000 people across the Danube frontier. And also, as it happened, many Romans took advantage of the situation. Many thought it was funny that the Visigoths, these proud Germans, had to humble themselves to such an extent that they had to supplicate or beg for assistance. And many Romans also thought it was funny to play tricks on the Visigoths. And many did things such as kidnap the children of the Visigoths and then sell them or sell them back to the parents for a price. Many did other things such as sell the Visigoths meat, only it would be dog meat. So the Visigoths were short of food. They weren't treated very well by many, not all, but by many Roman authorities who took advantage of the situation. And many Roman authorities were also scared because they were dealing with such a large number of peoples. So many forced the Visigoths to relinquish their weapons and to give up their weapons. So essentially come into a new territory without any means to be able to defend yourself. So this is the situation in which the Visigoths were confronted. So the logistics of transporting them across the Danube, of assigning them land and homesteads, and of finding some way to protect themselves and giving them a food supply. So the Visigoths were faced with all of these problems and what they perceived as imperial negligence. And in this situation, many of the Visigoths started to agitate. And they began to agitate amongst themselves, and they began to openly rebel once they were situated within imperial authority. That is, they wanted better land, they wanted better conditions, they wanted better treatment. Now, at first, imperial authorities were a little bit concerned, but then they kind of got tired of the situation and they regretted the fact that they allowed the Visigoths into Roman territory. And in fact, the Emperor Valens took up arms against the Visigoths. So the Emperor Valens, who had initially allowed the Visigoths to settle in Roman territory, now was taking up arms against them. Now, Valens did not call for reinforcements and thought that he would be able, with his own imperial force in Constantinople, be able to address the Visigoths himself. And this he did. In the year 378, the Emperor Valens and the Roman army, the Eastern Roman army, met the Visigoths at the Battle of Adrianople in the year 378. Now, in the ensuing melee, we have a disaster because Valens himself was forced to flee the battlefield, and according to one tradition, sought shelter in a barn which was set ablaze. But the end result was that the Eastern Emperor died at Adrianople, and the Visigoths were the victors. That is, the Visigoths, these Germanic Aryan barbarians, had defeated the Romans on their own territory. Now, very quickly, we have to establish a new emperor, Theodosius, who makes peace with the Visigoths and agrees to resettle them as foederati. They're settled into better territory within the Eastern Roman Empire, into areas of what was part of the former Yugoslavia in Illyria. So the Visigoths are willing to maintain that they are still Roman allies or federates, though in reality, the Visigoths have become kind of a sub-state within imperial territory. And in fact, they begin to mimic the Roman Empire by electing their first high king. Up to this point, the Visigoths had only had chieftains. The first high king is Alaric. And so they're imitating the Romans by Romans have an emperor. The Visigoths now, for their executive, they have a king. Well, Alaric made it pretty clear that he wanted better land, and he was especially interested in Italy. Now, Italy was part of the Western Roman Empire, and the Western Roman emperors at this time were trying to keep Alaric out of Italy. So to make sure that Alaric and the Visigothic forces stayed in the eastern part of the empire. By the same token, the Western Roman emperors were also bolstering the Rhine frontier, because as the Hunnic forces pushed deeper and deeper into Eastern and Central Europe, more and more Germanic tribes asked for permission to be settled as foederati. And of course, having witnessed the experience of the Visigoths, the emperor said no. No new large tribal migrations into Roman territory, as we will end up creating these sub-Germanic states within the Roman state. So the emperor said no more Germans. And the Western emperors were forced to bolster not just the Rhine frontier, but also the Italian frontier to make sure that the Visigoths don't try to migrate into Italy. Now, as it would happen, in the winter of 406, the Rhine River froze over completely. The Rhine River froze over completely, and the Romans simply didn't have the manpower to maintain or defend the entire river. And as a result, assorted groups of Germanic peoples fled across the Rhine River, seeking to get away from the Huns. So we have the Franks who pour across, we have the Vandals who pour down, we have the Suevi who pour down. And the Western Roman emperors forced to move more troops away from the Italian frontier to bolster the Rhine frontier. And in fact, also, the Western emperor has to evacuate the province of Britannia, or Britain, in order to rebolster the Rhine. So Britain is evacuated as more Roman troops are brought to the Rhine River to bolster it, to try to stop more Germans from invading. Now, as would happen, forces stationed on the Italian frontier were diverted to the north to protect the Rhine. In so doing, this gave Alaric and the Visigoths their opportunity to invade Italy. Alaric invaded Italy and in the year 410 sacked the city of Rome. Now, this shocked contemporaries because although Rome, in the West, the city of Rome had been in political decline for a while. It had become less important, but it was still Rome, and it was a symbol of the Roman Empire. And the sack of the city of Rome in 410 shocked, it reverberated throughout the Roman world. And the big question was, how do we explain this? And of course, many people explain the sack in many different ways, but the most common, one of the most common complaints was that of pagans. And pagans complained that it was the fault of Christians, that Christians had accepted this new religion, they had abandoned the gods that had made Rome great, and so the pagan gods were retaliating by allowing these Germanic Aryan barbarians to sack their city. And of course, Augustine of Hippo responded to these charges in his famous work on the City of God. Now, Alaric's sack of Rome wasn't that bad in terms of a sack, because it was a 3-day sack, and since Alaric and the Visigoths were Arian Christian, they respected churches. So they didn't pillage the entire city. Nevertheless, Rome was sacked for the first time in 700 years. Now, eventually, Alaric withdraws with his Visigoths, and they settle in Spain. And in Spain, they keep up the pretense of being federates, although in reality, we have a Visigothic monarchy that extends from Spain to really central Gaul under Alaric. But at least it maintains that it's a federate state of Rome. So already the first major Germanic sub-state we have in the old Roman Empire is the Visigothic state. And it gradually becomes more and more Romanized. As it becomes more and more Romanized, the law codes of the Visigoths are written down. So we have Germanic law codes. Now they're written down in Latin, though. Latin becomes remains the administrative and the standard language. The only major problem about integration is the issue of religion, because Arians are not supposed to marry Nicenes. However, usually when Visigoths move into an area, they will claim let's say perhaps 1/3 the property. There's different models, but usually 1/3 of the property of the Roman citizens in return for protection and in return for governance. So we will protect you, we'll keep you safe as long as you can give us 1/3 of your property. And this was generally the pattern, although there were different techniques of accommodation. Now, the Visigoths were content to remain federates or friends of Rome, allies of Rome within the Roman territories. Many of the other Germanic tribes were not. The Visigoths had pushed into North Africa a group known as the Vandals. And of all the Germanic peoples, the Vandals were the ones who were the most hostile to Roman civilization. The Romans tried to establish some type of federate status with the Vandals, but the Vandals weren't interested. And in fact, they overran Carthage, and throughout the old Roman provinces of Africa, the Vandals became the dominant power. And the Vandals were very, very hostile to Rome. So on the southern flank of the Western Roman Empire, we have a Germanic state that doesn't even pretend to be allied or friendly to Rome. Now, as it happened, the Huns kept advancing into Central Europe. And by the 440s, they have a very energetic new leader named Attila. Attila had recently killed his brother and inherited the Hunnic throne and ruled over an empire which extended from modern-day Germany back to Mongolia. So one of these huge steppe empires, which makes us think of the Mongol Empire of much later, but a huge steppe empire that extends all the way from Germany back deep into Asia. And Attila himself was very interested in Roman territory and Roman culture, and he crossed the Rhine frontier with his Hunnic forces. Now, Attila's army would have been less Hunnic in complexion than it would have been Germanic, because more Germans along the way were pressed into military service. So we have a very large army that would have been more and more German. But it was very important for the Western Roman emperors to deal with Attila, because it was the one thing that united all the Germans. They were afraid of Attila. And as long as the Romans could keep Attila in the balance, then the Visigoths and other groups would realize that they needed Roman power there. What the Romans did is they allied with the Visigoths, the Foederati, and in 451, they met Attila in battle at the Battle of Catalonian Plains, just outside the city of Orleans in Gaul in modern-day France. So in 451, the Romans and the Visigoths met Attila and his army, which was a combination of Huns and Germans and various other people who were pressed into service along the way. The end result of the battle was that the Romans won. However, Attila himself survived. And in a very unusual maneuver, Attila immediately invaded Italy. So a very unexpected procedure. Now, the major fear was that Attila was going to sack Rome with his remnant forces. But instead, the person who saved Rome happened to be the Bishop of Rome, later known as Papa or Pope, Pope Leo I. And we have variant traditions of the story. Pope Leo either prayed and prayed and prayed and dissuaded Attila from coming to Rome and sacking the city, or according to alternate versions, paid him lots of ransom money to go away. So the truth is probably somewhere in between and combines both elements of prayer and ransom money. Whatever the case was, Attila did not sack the city of Rome. Instead, he turned northwards and died shortly thereafter. And the Hunnic Empire, like many of these steppe empires, was an empire that was based on the personality of one person. And once Attila died, his empire began to dissolve, and many of the subject peoples began to break free, the Ostrogoths and other Germanic groups that had been pressed into military service. So the Hunnic Confederation began to dissolve, and the Western Roman Empire is overrun with more and more of these Germanic groups that break free from ex-Hunnic control. Now, to complicate matters, shortly after the death of Attila, the Vandals in North Africa take a navy, and with their fleet, they sack the city of Rome for the second time. So in the year 455, Rome is sacked for the second time in the 5th century. And of course, the Vandal sack is so horrible and so notorious, this gives rise to the word vandalism today. The Vandals not only looted the entire city, but they stole much of the imperial family and took them back to Carthage. So Rome was in shambles in 455, and most of the emperors were no longer even living in the city. They were living in Ravenna because it was more easily fortified. However, Rome itself suffered a severe sack, and the emperors that we have throughout the remainder of the 5th century are usually made and unmade by the master of the horse or the master of the soldiers. So we have a series of weak emperors. The end result is that in 476, the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, or Little August one, is deposed, and hereafter we no longer have Western Roman emperors. However, what emerges in the West is a series of Germanic substates. So in North Africa, the heir to the Roman Empire is the Vandal state, centered around the city of Carthage. Okay? In Gaul, in Spain, in southern Gaul, we have a Visigothic state. Okay? So these are Germans who are friendly and would like to preserve Roman traditions. Eventually in Italy, Odoacer was the German who deposed the last Roman emperor, but eventually Theodoric will be the German who founds an Ostrogothic state in Italy, an Ostrogothic state. Now the Ostrogoths were also Nicene Christian, or also Arian Christians, like the Visigoths and the Vandals, so they all were heretics. But in Italy, the Ostrogoths worked very, very well with the local population. Sure, they might have requested 1/3 of land and resources, but at least in Rome, the Senate still continued to meet, consuls were still appointed, so it looked as if all the machinery of the Roman Empire was still intact. Two other Germanic groups, of course the Franks move into what was northern Gaul, and the Burgundians move into what eventually became Burgundy in France. And so by 476, we have a pattern of Germanic substates, all of which have checkered histories. The one that has the shortest lifespan is, of course, the Vandal kingdom. Because what happens in North Africa is the Vandals, out of all the Germanic tribes we've seen, liked Roman civilization the least and persecuted Nicene Christians. And due to these persecutions and due to other problems, the Eastern emperors in Constantinople were called in. And the late 520s, 527 to 529, we have the Vandal Wars. And Constantinople rapidly overran North Africa. And so the Vandal Empire simply disappears, and North Africa, including Carthage, is incorporated into the Eastern Roman Empire, which continued to survive until 1453. So of all the Germanic successor states, the Vandals have the shortest shelf life. Now, of all of these Germanic substates, the one that we would expect to be the most successful was Italy, because Italy had a population base. It was the old heartland of the Roman Empire. We have the Senate, we have the consuls, and the Ostrogoths and the Romans worked in very close collaboration. Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths, was fluent in Latin and Greek, had a very deep appreciation and respect for Roman culture, and tried to keep a balance and a harmony between Germanic and Roman culture. And this worked well for a while, that he appointed very educated old Roman patricians and aristocrats into the civil service and kept the status quo. So much of the old Roman traditions continued. The problem was the issue of religion, because since Theodoric and since the Ostrogoths were Arian Christians, whenever they saw Nicene Christians in correspondence with Constantinople, they smelled conspiracy, and they were afraid of conspiracy, especially after Constantinople attacked the Vandals and conquered them. And later in Theodoric's reign, in the 5-teens and the 520s, Theodoric increasingly becomes paranoid and suspicious, and he's forced to execute many of his top advisors around him. As his reign ends, there is a succession dispute, and this provides an opportunity for Constantinople to intervene. Constantinople will intervene, and the end result is a series of wars known as the Gothic Wars. The Gothic Wars last from about 530 to 560. And they are a series of wars in which the Eastern Roman Emperor has troops retake Italy. Then the Italian peninsula is retaken by the Goths. The forces of Constantinople have to retake it. This continues on for 30 years. Rome changes sides about 4 times. And as you can imagine, the victor at the end of the Roman Wars, if the Pyrrhic victor at the end of the Gothic Wars, is the Emperor of Constantinople. So although Italy's united to Constantinople, Italy is in shambles because of 30 years of warfare. Italy's depopulated, aqueducts, roads, infrastructure's destroyed. Rome's changed hands so many times, the city walls are in shambles. So Rome in the Italian peninsula is a virtual mess. So although it's restored to the Roman Empire in Constantinople and the Goths are defeated, Italy in the year 500 was a prize. In the year 600 is destroyed. Of the other states, the Visigothic state is the one that seems as if it would have a lot of success. It was really the first Germanic sub-state founded. It thrives in Spain, and it does very well. Eventually, under Recared, the Visigoths convert to Nicene Christianity. And once they convert to Nicene Christianity, the Visigoths and the native population begin to blend in. So increasingly the German, the Romanic, and the Roman elements become indistinguishable. And in fact, it is a Romance-based language that wins out in Portugal, Spain, Gaul, France, and Italy, which tells us that the number of Germanic warriors must have been very, very small and absorbed fairly rapidly. In Spain, however, the Visigoths, once they convert to Christianity, they become very, very ardent Christians, ardent Nicene Christians. And once they convert to Nicene Christianity, they begin to persecute the only other non-Christian group in the Iberian Peninsula, and that is, of course, the Jews. And one of the earliest instances we have of severe anti-Semitism comes from the Visigothic monarchies. Now, So there was instability within the Visigothic state as they began to persecute the Jews. As Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, had a significant Jewish population. But there also was instability because the Visigoths, like the old Romans, had never established a very set succession mechanism. So when one emperor died, or one king died, it never was clear who the next king would be, and there could be a multiple number of claimants to the royal crown. Contemporaries referred to this as the Gothic sickness, because when a Visigothic king became king, he would have to kill off a number of opponents, and then when he himself died, there would be a number of claimants who would all have to duke it out to determine who would be the next king. So this lack of stability within the political structure led to Gothic sickness and provided inherent weakness within the Visigothic structure. In fact, in the early 8th century, in the year 711, the Arabs reached Gibraltar, and by 725, the Visigothic kingdom falls to the Arabs. So most of medieval history, Spanish history, is Muslim history and not Christian history, as really until the Reconquista movement begins in the 11th century, large portions of the Iberian Peninsula will be ruled by Arabs or Moors or various Islamic peoples. Now, the barbarian state that you would expect to be the least successful actually becomes the most successful, and that group is the Franks. Now, the Franks were successful in one major area, and that is, unlike the Vandals or the Visigoths or the Ostrogoths, they did not have to migrate thousands and thousands of miles to find a new homeland. In fact, the Franks simply crossed the Rhine frontier, so they moved from the east bank to the west bank of the Rhine. So they didn't have to move very far, so they remained close to their tribal roots. The other thing, too, is the Franks were easily able to defeat whatever remained of Roman power in northern Gaul. We hear about Sagrius and other sources that these people referred to as kings, but more than likely they were simply Roman generals who, were still around and are defeated by the Franks. The Franks, like the other Germanic groups, imitate the Romans and develop high kingship. Okay, so all of the Germanic groups developed high kingship from the Romans. The first high king of the Franks we have is Clovis. And in the 470s and 480s, he established high kingship by killing all the other Frankish tribal leaders. So once there were no other tribal leaders left alive, Clovis was the established high king. However, unlike all the other Germanic groups, Clovis was a pagan. He wasn't an Arian Christian. And sometimes it's better to be pagan than it is to be a heretic, because, at least in the eyes of the Christians, because if you were a pagan, there was always a possibility that you might see the light and become a Christian, a Nicene Christian, a Christian of the right variety. Well, as it happened, Clovis was able to conquer Burgundy and married Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who happened to be a Nicene Christian. And Clotilde put heavy pressure on Clovis to convert to Christianity. Now, he wasn't interested, and he wanted to worship his idols, our sources tell us. So he worshipped the traditional Germanic deities of Thor, Woden, Tyr, although, of course, our Roman sources refer to them as Jupiter and Hercules, and as we'd expect the Latin or the Romanized sources to do. Now, Clovis, when Clotilde gave birth to the first son, Clotilde wanted to have the son baptized. Now, Clovis is not a Christian, but he agrees that he will go along with this procedure. And Clotilde has the male child, baptized, presumably Clovis's heir, and the minute the child's baptized, it dies. Now, Clovis at this point is furious and hates this new religion. He doesn't like it. And after Clotilde gives birth to the second child, another son, and presumably Clovis's heir, Clotilde pleads with him again to have the child baptized. And the literary sources have a long debate between Clovis and Clotilde over whether they should have the second child baptized. As it happens, they decide to do so. And the child becomes deathly ill. And of course, Clovis, as you can imagine, is very, very angry and doesn't like this Christian God at all. However, Clotilde prays and prays and prays, and the child survives. So Clovis begins to think more about this religion. And as it happens, one day he's on the battlefield and he's fighting another Germanic group known as the Alemanni. And just as he looks over the hills, he sees new waves of Alemanni forces approaching. And Clovis realizes that for the first time, he's going to be defeated and he's going to be killed in battle. And Clovis stops and thinks, and he says, "What should I do?" And he gets on his hands and knees. And he says, "My gods have failed me. My gods have not helped me. Clotilde's God, O God of my wife, can you please help me?" And immediately, thousands of Frankish troops suddenly show up, and they run and they overrun the Alemanni, and it becomes a huge Frankish victory. Clovis is so happy that after the battle, he goes to the local bishop, and he says, "I want you to take me and all of my soldiers and take us to the local river and baptize us." So Clovis chooses Christianity, again, another battlefield conversion similar to that of Constantine. And in this instance, Clovis chooses the Christianity, the form of Christianity that was recognized by Rome. He chooses Nicene Christianity. And this conversion had multiple benefits for Clovis because it allowed the Franks to intermarry with the local population, since the Franks were now Orthodox, since they all were one religion. It made the bishops allies of Clovis as they supported the king, as he supported Christianity. And in fact, he used Christianity as an effort to expand his kingdom. He's known to have said, "I hate it that these Arian Visigoths control part of my kingdom. I want it back." And he uses Christianity to declare war on the Visigoths. And actually, he takes much of southern Gaul back from the Arian Visigoths using Christianity as a pretext. Clovis also does several other things. Clovis also has the Frankish law codes written down. And so, like other Germanic rulers, he's imitating the Romans by instituting high kingship and by codifying or writing down the laws. Now, generally, as the pattern goes, the further you are away from Roman influence, the more Germanic your law codes are. And this is very, very true with the Franks, because the Frankish law code had been based on precedent or custom. And under this type of system, you wait for some crime to occur, and then you assess a penalty. Now, the penalty in the Germanic tradition is called a Wehrgeld, W-E-R-G-I-L-D, or literally man money. And what it is a monetary consideration of the crime. So essentially blood money that you pay rather than have clan warfare or a Hatfield and McCoy's type situation to avenge perceived wrongs. And so the Frankish law codes recognize different social classes: the king, obviously, the table companions of the king, Frankish noblewomen, free peoples, half-free peoples, slaves. So there's a variety of different types of social statuses, all with different Wehrgelds. Now, the Wehrgeld can be the entire person, so if I'm killed, you must pay my family a Wehrgeld, or it can be proportional. If you cut off my pinky, you must pay a part of my Wehrgeld. Or if you cut off my thumb, which of course would be much more important, as I need my thumb in order to wield the sword. So the Wehrgelds are proportional, but they also tell us a lot about Frankish culture, because in order for there to be a law in the Frankish law code, it had to have occurred at least once. Many of these laws concern animals and the theft of animals. Many concern property. Many surprise us. As an example, if you hit a man on the head so hard that part of his brain is exposed, you're required to pay X amount. Now, what this tells us is that this happened at least once. It wouldn't be a law unless it happened at least once. So the Frankish law codes are based on tradition, or based on precedent and tradition. Of course, the Roman populations in all of these areas had their own law codes based on old Roman traditions. Frankish law, in all Germanic law, was based on ethnicity. So the Franks followed their law code, the Romans followed their own. And over the period of time, as the two groups became more intermarried and integrated, the law codes gradually became more and more Germanic in complexion as more and more of the German laws began to integrate with the Roman law codes. But Clovis has the Frankish laws written down for the first time and also establishes a dynasty. His dynasty is known as the Merovingian dynasty. And it's called Merovingian after a legendary ancestor named Merovech. So he establishes a Merovingian dynasty, which will rule over the Frankish state for over 250 years. However, one of the problems with the Frankish state is the Franks, up until Clovis, had never had a state. They had been tribal peoples without a high king, with many tribal chieftains. So they didn't really perceive of a state in the same way that a modern person would as a product of the Enlightenment. And so Clovis kind of thought of the state as a possession. And according to Frankish law, all possessions were to be divided equally amongst all sons. So according to Clovis, all possessions had to be divided up equally amongst his 4 surviving sons, which meant that when Clovis died, the Frankish Empire is divided into 4 parts. And these 4 parts are not even contiguous units. One son might receive a portion over here, over here, over here, over here, over here. One son might receive a portion here, here, and here, and here. And the general pattern that we see in Merovingian history is for there to be a division, and then eventually one son emerges as victorious, then a subdivision, and one son emerges as victorious. So this is essentially the pattern that we have throughout Merovingian history. But the Merovingian dynasty is a success because of Clovis's conversion to Christianity, Nicene Christianity. For a while, he's the only Western ruler in communion with Rome. For the writing down of the law codes, and for the integration of the Franks into a largely Romanized population, which will allow Merovingian Gaul a much greater success story than Visigothic Spain or Ostrogothic Italy.
Well, you know, Rome was already weakened, of course. You've learned by the time these Germanic peoples kind of carved the western half up. Like I'd mentioned, they had the plague and the economy was bad. And also another point I wanted to make before we left today would be that the problem with dynastic succession will hurt the Roman Empire. We've seen throughout our lectures discussing the civil wars that take place just almost constantly throughout Roman history. And it was based on who would become the next ruler or emperor as we have it. Now we've seen, of course, that Diocletian in previous lectures managed to take over and rule in his own right as an absolute. Diocletian no longer made the point of being a co-ruler with the Senate. He was open about his power. We also learned about Constantine and how, of course, and Theodosius the Great, he's the last ruler to unite, to rule over a united Roman Empire, because we obviously have seen it split into West and East. He officially made Christianity the religion of Rome. But for the most part, there's civil war, and it's because of the dynastic succession and who will take over, who will succeed when a ruler is either assassinated, which becomes very common, or, of course, if he dies a natural death. And so this all led up to these Germanic tribes pretty much carving out the western half of the Roman Empire. So when we come back on our next lecture, we'll focus on the eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, as it's called, with its center of government in a place called, right there in Asia Minor, Nicomedia. In fact, Constantine actually built his capital on the old Greek city called Byzantium. He called it Constantinople. Today it's Istanbul. So right there in that region will be the center of the Byzantine Empire. And we'll, of course, learn more about that on our next lecture. Until next time.